All right. Yeah, so welcome to another edition here of the Forecast Contest discussion. It's October 8th. We're forecasting for the 16 to 20-day window, forecasting HDDs now. And we're fortunate today to have Bradley from Maxar joining us as our industry representative. In terms of the agenda for today, what I propose is we start with attribution, kind of looking back for the first 15 minutes or so, and then we can get into our forecast discussion. Usually we save the best for last. So Bradley, if you're okay, we'll kind of save you for last. You'll get to hear our perspectives, and then we'll give you as much time as you need. And you could also use that to, kind of like a brief introduction. It's been a little while since we've had you on the call. And then usually what we try to do is spend the rest of the time talking about big forecast issues of the day or important forecast issues of the day or some relevant research topics. And with that, I do have a question. Michael, I know you've been working on some research regarding bias corrections with the ECMWF. Is there anything that you would like us to try to save time for near the end of the meeting today?
I just finished the summary page, so if you want to see how that's going, I don't know if that's worth going over today, though.
Okay. So it sounds like there's nothing critical on your end. If we have a couple minutes, we can do it. But if not, we can maybe do it another time. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I mean it's nothing like that needs to be done today.
Okay. It's definitely Bradley. It's definitely something we'll keep you in the loop on, though. It's research. We're always trying to do research that we think is applicable to industry and folks like you. So as soon as we get it into a working order, whether it's through one of these discussion videos or whatever, or just offline, we'll definitely share it with you and kind of solicit your feedback and things like that.
That's great. Thank you.
Sure. And one other project you may be aware of that we're more directly working with Maxar on is Zach's working on a MJO research project. And again, we don't have anything formal today, but there may be a couple questions that come up at the end where we just kind of pick your brain as someone who's on the front lines in terms of applying MJO information to the forecast. That's okay. All right. Okay, so we can get into it now. So again, we'll start with the before I dive full in, because I know it's been a little while here, Bradley, if there's anything you see on the screen that has changed and is unexpected, maybe just since the last time you were here, please jump in, let us know. Okay. All right, so we'll start with attribution. Again, here I'll kind of walk us through, but please, this is interactive. Jump in whenever you see something. So I'm going to go to the most recent verification we have. This is from the forecast made on September 17th. You got the information up here. The target window was October 2nd to October 6th, so we just kind of passed it. And just remember here at this point, so all our forecasts that were issued in September or earlier are CDDs, right? So this is still a CDD verification period here. And I did look through this a little bit earlier. So a couple of things, interesting takeaways that kind of stood out to me, I was just talking about this with Zach, was that again, for the fourth week in a row, I think, the CDD verification or observation, which came in at 28.6, was above any of our forecasts. So just again, the heat, in particular in I guess the Southeast and South, but this is a national number, again, overachieved. Really impressive number here. Blew away like any of the closest forecasts you can see here. The next closest forecast, 19.9. And then all the way down to 14.7. So that's certainly one of the things that I'll just bring up to the group here. And actually, maybe this is a good stopping point. I mean, again, this is like the fourth week in a row. And maybe Bradley, if I can, maybe I'll even put you on the spot. And I'll be fully transparent here. I don't have a good answer for this. but you've obviously been watching this very closely. And before we even get into maybe why maybe things are changing now, but for the last 4 whatever weeks, consistently seeing the forecast come in or verification come in so strong. Do you have any thoughts or sort of observations in terms of why it seems like at least a lot of the forecasts in our contest had a difficulty resolving the scope or the intensity of the heat and the CDDs associated with this pattern?
Yeah, I mean, it was just a very amplified pattern, as you said, and sometimes it's difficult to forecast a top 5 high PWCDD forecast 16 to 20 days out. So that's certainly in the realm there. Can actually.
And by the way, if you'd like to share the screen, just let me know. I can hand it over.
Yeah. So yeah, there's the map there. I think the elements for having a warmer than normal period was certainly there. The ECM weeklies especially had that. Actually, I might share my screen here, show you what we had from say September 17th.
Okay, you should be able to share your screen now. Sometimes it's hidden.
Yeah.
There we go.
You
Yep.
see that?
Yep.
So that's our 16 to 20 day forecast from September 2017 for the period from October 2 to October 6. So you saw the verification map. Certainly things came in cooler, really northwest to north central, but quite a bit more amplified to the hotter side in the south, where we are going to have our CDDs in early October. Really the main area to see any of those. But you can see from the ECM Weeklies model that was certainly showing a similar pattern idea where you would have that hotter south, and actually among the members there was a larger spread, but certainly a lot more tilted to the higher side. So say the verification was 28.57. That's on the upper end here, but certainly falling within the member. So there was some support for having this warm pattern, but certainly given how amplified it was, that's very difficult to forecast 16 to 20 days out. Typically when you are forecasting 16 to 20 days out, yes, we'd like to get the weighted degree day number right, but knowing how verifications work at that lead time, a lot of this is mainly trying to capture the pattern at that stage.
Got it. And is there anything? So point taken about the forecasting the intensity of something like this is difficult, and how often are you going to try to forecast like a record or near record event, like you said, at 16 to 20 days out? That being said, is there anything looking back at this period of September in particular, I guess? Pretend it's next August or whatever, early September. Is there anything in particular, though, that maybe we've learned or you've learned from this that might stand out and say, you know what, I'm gonna increase, I'm gonna go a little bit hotter than based on something I saw? Or do you look at this recent period of the past month or so and it's you just chalk it up to one of those things like it's still beyond the limits of the science kind of thing?
No, I mean, there certainly was a reason to go additionally hotter, but obviously with lead time, you got to be careful on just how aggressive you want to be. It's not often you're going to forecast a top 5 record period, but if you still see my screen here,
Yeah.
this is subsoil departures from normal for October the 2nd. It had been going very dry in the south. We've seen expansion of drought in that region, and certainly that played a role in why it got so hot. But I mean, during that time frame, I think we had temperatures touching the low 100s in parts of the southeast. Actually, I can show you the highest maximums there. A lot of these were daily records. 2 to 6, right? I think October 2 to 6.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, I mean, we had low 100s in the southeast, daily records, and that's just not something that you would forecast that far out. But yeah, I mean, certainly this is one of those rarer cases, though, given just how anomalous it was. It's just really difficult to just given the lead time.
Got it. And one, at least on my end, one last attribution question. I'll put you on the spot on. Do you think there's how much do you carry forward information from like September? Now obviously we're moving into October. How much do you carry forward that like a memory of what happened in September into October? Is it one of these things where, hey, we're in transition seasons and, you just can't put too much weight on it? Or do you tend to see more persistence and patterns and stuff in these 2 months?
Yeah, so I mean, it certainly has a role. I think in order to know where you're going forward, it helps to know where you come from. So, in that respect, you can't forget what happened in September. In this particular case, we didn't see a whole lot of changing within the pattern. One of the things that was changing was the negative glam, which was there all of September, but had been going much deeper. That's your global wind oscillation, much like a La Nina-like atmospheric response that we were seeing there. But that was present all of September. So from a pattern perspective, there really wasn't too much of a forcing out there that would suggest that you would have a major change in the pattern. So if we look at where our forecast was on September 17th, it wasn't different than where our forecast was for the second half of September. Obviously in this case, it was a lot more anomalous than what we had forecasted, but the general pattern themes were still there.
Got it. Okay. Right. So Bradley, if you don't mind, if you can give me back the share screen, I was just going to pull up a couple other, thank you. I was going to pull up a couple other things on attribution, and then we can shift to something else. So let me pull up the archive here. Before, just last thing though, before I shift away from this period, October 2nd, October 6th, does anyone have any other comments they want to make about this particular period? Otherwise, I'm gonna look more broadly at the cooling season and things like that. Okay. So yeah. So like I said, we also like to tend to look more high level and just kind of look at the performance metrics, for the last 30, 60, 90 days, so on. So this is, I just did a ranking for the cooling season. So this started forecasts that were initialized in May. We actually only have, I think, one more forecast, and then we'll have our final tallies. But you can see here, positive numbers good, negative numbers not so good. And then you've got your bias category, your counts, and performance relative consensus. We've got some new contestants here actually recently. Paul Roundy just started to enter forecasts. You can see the counts here are pretty low. In terms of forecasters who have contributed a more significant amount of time, Zach, who's sitting next to me here, has done quite well, and now he's over forecasting over 50% of the time. So that's a nice number there to be at the top here. And then, of course, we've been talking about this all summer. The 10-year normal has been very difficult to beat in terms of forecasts that have been submitted. Let's say at least 75% of the time, the 10-year normal is the benchmark. Week to week, this is the 10-year normal from Maxar, and it's at the top here. In terms of the next human forecaster, SD is Professor Decker. And he's forecast about 75% of the time, so you can see he's up there. And then, we've got different inputs, the ECMWF. It's been kind of all over the place, but, obviously not, by this benchmark, it has been not not as good as the 30-year normal. And then you have the CFS, which is lower than that. So just a few comments, I guess, a few pointers on some of the inputs. Looking more recently, I do want to give the ECMWF a quick nod. I think I'm going to click on the 30-day. There's a little bit of a lag, but here's the 30-day. Yeah, the ECMWF has done much better over the past couple weeks. So that's something to keep in mind. I'll open this up here in a second in terms of, is that just, is it back? It's been back and forth. Is that just, it's in a good period, but don't get too excited about it? Or maybe is it something, is it performing better here? Maybe also just the fact that we're coming out of summer and it's something to, hang your hat on a little bit more. I also wanted to bring up at least one other observation here. A lot of times we're quite critical of our persistence inputs. And in fact, to be honest, sometimes I don't even look at them. We keep our persistence inputs in case anyone's trying to find them in our sandbox, because, less call them unofficial kind of inputs. It's still something we're testing. But since we just kind of had this conversation a little bit with Bradley, the idea of the persistence is just basically say, hey, if the last 10 days or 15 days or 30 days, if you think they're representative of what's going to happen next, then you should put some weight on it. And perhaps this is not surprising since we've been in such a freaking hot pattern for a while now, that the persistence inputs have actually performed quite well over the last 30 days. But again, buyer beware. As you expect, persistence does well when the pattern is persistent. But if for whatever reason you think the pattern's not going to, it's going to change, you got to be really careful about putting too much weight on those inputs. I think those are the only significant sort of observations I had. Anyone else want to make a comment in terms of any of the information they're seeing here in our performance metrics?
I think based on that pattern that we saw in July, the EC seems to do well when there's like a consistent pattern. So like it's been significantly warm for the past 3 or 4 weeks, and it almost seems like the EC kind of settles into it and does well, and that's why we're seeing it do well in the 30-day window. But then, like I said, last week when we looked at that July 9th big bust forecast, it was when it shifted back to a cooler signal. So the EC stayed warm, it was cool, and then the forecast did really poorly. So it almost seems like it settles into a groove when there is a consistent pattern. Right. But
no, that's a really good point. And I don't have the graphic handy, and I'm not going to try to search for it at the moment. But one of our other student researchers, Luke LaBelle, has started kind of look into that, and he had a really good graphic that showed during the 3 or 4, what I'd call, is somewhat subjective, but significant pattern shifts of the summer, going back to June, I think, the ECMWF did not resolve them well. And I think this goes even into the big September change, right? When September turned into a record-breaking month. I think even from that, in that shift, going from less warm to record-breaking warmth, it lagged behind, at least at the 16 to 20-day window. And if, by the way, Bradley, if any that sounds off or anything, please jump in. But I believe that's kind of what we saw here. So I guess
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see that a lot from ECMWF, where whatever the primary pattern has been or what it's seeing over the next 2 weeks, it tends to like to keep that going even past the 2-week time frame.
Yep. So that's definitely something that we'll have to, again, buyer beware, be careful about that. Again, the recent performance looks good, but we've seen this before, right? We've seen it before. And then, if you do have some tinglings about a pattern change, you got to be cautious about putting too much weight on the ECMWF. I just wanted to bring up give one other plug here. performance relative to consensus, which I think is an interesting, data point to look at. If I sort it by there, Michael, who's on the line, continues to do quite well. In fact, again, with human forecasts that have participated 75% of the time, Michael's at the top here at plus 3.5%. So it's been really hard to beat consensus. In fact, just one other note, especially for Bradley, if we look at consensus going all the way back to the beginning of the contest, so now I'm sorting this back to, I think these have forecasts going back to November. I believe consensus is here, and there's no forecast that beats consensus that has participated, 75% of the time. So consensus has been a tough benchmark to beat. So, okay. We can shift to today's forecast, and if everyone's ready. Let's see. So again, today's the 8th. Michael, would you like to kick us off and tell us about today's forecast?
Sure. So I went with 57.2 HDDs. Went with my usual 60% teleconnections, 30% CPC, and 10% 10-year. That's the 10-year normal on this page. NAO and AO seem to be heading towards negative, although I do maintain that there's some uncertainty with that since the ensemble members get a little bit spread out towards the end of the period. But I went with negative. PNA, I also went with negative, but same thing. It's kind of spread out, so a lot of uncertainty I saw, at least with this and looking through the other forecasts. I see that seems to be a common theme. CPC is showing some broad warmth across most of the country, except for the central part. But most of it was in the south, and I'm pretty sure that even through late October, that the south is not a big HDD producer, and I think I checked, it doesn't produce much more than I think one HDD, so I didn't really factor that too much. The rest of the warmth was only about 55%, so it didn't seem to be very confident in the warmth there. So that was really all I saw. And one other thing I noticed that's very interesting to me is the CFS seems to be the coldest forecast, with the Euro being the warmest forecast, so we'll see which one of them ends up being right. It seems they're seeing completely different patterns.
It's a good point. I'll just pull it up here so you can see it using Maxar's site. Let's see, look at temperatures first. All right, so here's the most recent ECMWF, and then here is with the CFS. It's a little bit tricky because you can look at it from the most recent run or sort of an average, but regardless, however you do it, you can see that certainly it's quite a bit cooler than the ECMWF.
Yeah, especially in the Northeast, so that'll be important for the verification. Depending on which one of these ends up being right.
Right, and you can see, just to make your point, you see the difference. Actually, I'll just switch real quick to these plots just because you can see it better. The dailies. You see some of these differences really start by the 6 to 10. Let's see if I can. Yeah, I mean, you see the GFS, the intensity of that trough, in the Northeast, and then the EC by day 10 is already much weaker, and then here's day 12. So you can just you can see some of that evolution kind of coming together, well before the 16 to 20. But yeah. Okay. Anything else there, Michael, before we turn it over to Zach?
No, that's all. That's all from me.
Okay, great. Did you want the screen or you?
No.
Okay.
So again, this is only our second forecast in the heating season, and unlike the summer where I had a very consistent forecast formula, have not yet found that for the heating season yet. I have to wait for some of the verifications to come in to see. So my formula changed a little bit from last week. I factored into the CPC as well as the 10-year normal and the 30-year normal. CPC, as Michael pointed out, is showing some warm patterns across most of the country, and I did see that there was potential for some above average warmth in those areas, especially in the Northeast and the Pacific Northwest and Alaska, where we would start, where those HDD areas are. And then the 10-year normal kind of mirrored the CPC in that sense, where it was going a bit warmer than the 30-year normal. So factoring those two in, and the fact that I didn't really see anything clear in the teleconnections, as Michael also pointed out, there was a lot of variability. So I went with the value a bit warmer than the 30-year at about 54 with normal spread.
Okay. In terms of my my forecast, I'm input number one here. Actually, before I get to that real quick, I just want to make mention too here. So yeah, we do have this new MJO analog input, and just for Bradley's benefit there, it's something, it was developed by Dr. Decker. It basically looks at the current state, the current conditions of the MJO, and finds like the top 50 or 75 analogs based on initial conditions. And so today's MJO analog looks like it was just a little bit warmer or lower than the 30-year. And then I think I mentioned this already, but Paul Roundy, Professor Roundy, has also started to enter forecast. Caveat with him is he usually enters them a couple days before everyone else. So he's a little bit handicapped, so keep that in mind. But you can find more information about his forecast here too. But yeah, so where's my forecast? Input one down here. So my formula is there. It's basically an evolution of my summer formula. As I kind of go through my strategy statement, I'm starting to adjust it to account for the fact that it's my view that, based on my experience and different research, that summer is more influenced by climate change than winter, at least in the United States, at least what we've seen. So in the summer, I put a lot more weight on shorter term periods, like the 10-year normal or the top 10 hottest. Whereas in the winter, I found that, the 30-year normal, et cetera, can work works better. So I have been adjusting as we've starting to get into October and moving toward November. I'm starting to, each week I adjust my probabilities slightly. Beyond that, I did look at things like the MJO and whatnot, and the bottom line was I had a difficult time adjusting my forecast based on the MJO information. So I really didn't. I tend to be skeptical. I think some could argue cynical about how much the MJO, at least the inputs I have right now, can kind of, how much weight I should put on it that's not already a function of what we see in the models. So I looked at some of Paul Roundy's data. I looked at some of the data we have internally. I looked at some of these other things. And ultimately, I didn't find a clear signal based on all that. So I didn't move it there. A couple of the other data points that I looked at is, the cold source region in, do I have it up here? We've had a pretty good cold source region, right, in Western Canada. And, some view there that maybe the models underestimate that and things like that. That actually gave me a little bit of pause about the ECMWF, especially in the 11 to 15. How we're just talking about the differences of the two models in 11 to 15. The GFS being cooler in the Northeast, the ECMWF warmer. But again, at the end of the day, when I looked at my numbers are not as warm as the ECMWF. The ECMWF is at 46.7. My number was 52.5. So again, I felt like there's not nothing stands out to me that says, oh my God, if my number was significantly warmer than the ECMWF, that would give me pause, but I'm not. So I kind of looked at that, but at the end of the day, I didn't make any change there. One other thing I wanted to point out, because we kind of talked a lot about this in the attribution. So we talked about, hey, it's been persistently warm, yada yada. Is that continuing? And I quote unquote cheated here a little bit, and looked at what's going on here in the next 5 and 10 days. Are we still in this sort of record-breaking pattern? And sort of the long story short, I'm just trying to figure out what the best graphic to show here is. But long story short is it looks like finally we're seeing some weather here that's not as record-breaking warm, right, in some of the key areas and from a national perspective. So looking at the next 5, 10, 15 days here, we actually see, obviously now we're forecasting HDDs, but regardless, it's coming back down. It's no longer at the record warm levels, record low high CDDs or record low HDDs. That persistence pattern and whatever drove it, at least for the next 15 days, it does look like that's not, that's going to change. And so, I think that's an important data point here too. Not just to say, all right, let me just forecast record warmth or whatever. Things are changing in the short term, and I suspect I don't have strong reason to believe why they're going to go back to that record warm pattern in the 16 to 20. So just something else I looked at in terms of my forecast thinking, I guess. I think that's it. So Bradley, I'm gonna turn it over to you. And again, if you could just kick us off with a brief introduction, just for folks who don't remember you from last time.
Sure. Yeah. So my name's Brad Harvey. I'm the lead forecaster here at Maxar. Our business is focused largely on the energy industry and how the weather impacts that. We also do work with agriculture. My background is I went to college at The Ohio State University. I started working here at Maxar in 2011. I worked the overnight shift for a year, but then spent 3 years as the leading the forecast operations for Europe. And then from there, I moved into where my current role is as the lead forecaster, and I've been doing that since.
Great, thank you. And by the way, is it the Ohio State University?
Yeah, we tried to trademark it, but they said no.
Huh. Would you like to share your screen, or?
I mean, that's up to you. I certainly can.
Sure, go ahead. Why not? Just in case.
All right, sounds good. Share screen. All right, you guys see our forecast? All right, so the way we do things is a little bit different than I think I heard from you guys. We're not directly forecasting the GWHDD number itself. What we are doing is we're forecasting temperatures, and then we're just allowing those weighted degree day numbers to fall out of that forecast. So when we look at things in the morning, we're taking a look at this setup, what things are driving things leading into the period, and how might that change as we get into the 16 to 20 day period. And so in this morning's case, I decided to draw +3 anomalies for most of the west, except for the Pacific Northwest, a little bit cooler there, but then went near normal across the eastern half. And when we drew up that map, then the weighted degree day number fell out of it, which was right around 54.3 GWHDDs. But when looking at the forecast, there's one thing that is interesting. I think you alluded to it a little bit as far as model spread being large. What not really a particular pattern that's standing out. And I think a lot of that is because of a super typhoon that's currently in the Western Pacific. That is a storm that's going to be very near Japan over the upcoming weekend, and then ultimately going to be interacting with the Northern Pacific jet stream. So when you looked at the maps at the end of the 6 to 10 day period, what we see is a good agreement. Actually, I don't have let me actually pull up some of these other maps here. All right, So this would be 10 days out. Basically what we're seeing is this trough over the Gulf of Alaska into the Pacific Northwest. That's something that's agreed on upon all of the models, just to varying degrees of amplitude, except for Canadian. But that trough is actually related to that typhoon. So that's where the energy from that typhoon is where the model to be as we get to day 10. So as we go further in time, we watch some differences within the models during the 11 to 15 day period. The ECMWF model, the ensemble, takes the low and settles it over the southwest, enhances ridging over the eastern half. The GFS ensemble, on the other hand, suggests it maybe a little bit more progressive of a pattern in its 0Z run today, where it takes the trough by the end of the 11 to 15 day into the Midwest. So the question for us is there a model we believe? Is there a reason to go with one model or the other? Because certainly as we get in that 16 to 20 day, if we have a low setting up over the southwest and ridge over the eastern half, that certainly could give us that warmer response that the ECMWF Weeklies models is showing for the 16 to 20 day. But what if that trough is more progressive? It makes its way into the eastern half, because if that happens, certainly could carry some cooler air with it. Some of the background stuff that we look at, the MJO, the global wind oscillation, pull up a bunch of teleconnections here. Global wind oscillation is this bottom graphic here. It's strongly negative now. That's very much like a La Nina-like global wind pattern, but it is weakening considerably as we get through the 11 to 15 day period to where it's almost neutral, leading into the 16 to 20 day. We can look at that same graphic with the global atmospheric angular momentum from the GWO phase space perspective, and we're seeing it getting into phase 4 here. There's some question whether that's going to actually go forward in phase 5. ECMWF tends to like to not progress it forward enough, so there's that potential. But I think in that 16 to 20 day period, we're looking somewhere in that phase 4 to phase 5 realm. And then just to show you an example of what that might look like, pull up some analogs here for October GWO phase 4. These are just temperature analogs. You see that warmer west, cooler Midwest to south look. Phase 5 gives you a very similar look as well. So that's something that's in the background too. The MJO itself, the first map I just had up was actually our MJO analogs. I know you alluded to someone else having some MJO analogs that they look at. If we look at our MJO analogs, which is based on the past 15 days of actuals, and then progress that forward to the 16 to 20 day time frame, you're getting somewhat of a similar look here with this warmer west, somewhat cooler eastern half look to the pattern. With those background considerations, we're seeing the energy from that typhoon within our forecast, allowing that trough to be more progressive than maybe what the ECMWF model is wants to do. So using that support, we think the troughing does shift over to the eastern half, which is why we do have the normals to marginal belows there, and we do return some warmth to the west in response to that. Now, if that does occur and we do get that amplified response, that certainly could leave the eastern half colder. But one thing, given that models don't always handle typhoon activity very well, especially at this lead time, how that interacts with the northern Pacific jet stream, that is something that's keeping our confidence low. And so with that lower confidence, we are just being conservative right now with our eastern half forecast. That's why we're normal there as opposed to pulling below normal temperatures into that forecast. But you see from the ECMWF Weeklies model below, it has that much warmer look. That's because it does not progress the pattern like our forecast does. CFS been volatile, but it does show a little bit more of that pattern progression, and you do get a little bit more of that cooler signal over parts of the central U.S. This map here, by the way, is the average of the past 10 runs, and the weighted degree data below is also considers the past 10 runs. And you'll see that that model is largely spread. So that does play along with the lower confidence that is in the forecast for the 16 to 20-day period.
That's really great. It's really interesting. Is it so? I don't want to ask a leading question. Based on the super typhoon, if the forecast really does bust significantly in one direction, do you believe there's a directional skew there, one way or the other?
Right now, I would not give a directional skew to it. I would think that because typhoons do amplify the pattern, that maybe we are going to become more anomalous. But regionally, I don't have a good risk lean to the forecast. One thing that we'll have to keep a watch on, especially as these models it gets closer, this time frame gets closer, is how exactly is the typhoon going to interact with that northern Pacific jet stream. Yes, we're already seeing it within the models becoming amplified, but one thing that the models do diverge on is just how extended eastward that jet stream becomes. So the GFS, which is that more progressive look that perhaps gets a little bit closer to our forecast, where we do allow that trough to get into the eastern half, that does allow that extension of the jet stream all the way into the Pacific Northwest, whereas the Euro stops it just short of that. And that's probably why it's really stalls out the pattern like it's showing.
Okay, it's your view that the super typhoon, you think there's a amplitude risk to the pattern associated with it, but it doesn't really tell you where that amplitude is going to be, and that's so I was kind of almost leading you to say, hey, there's a significantly colder risk in the east, but I think your point is that high amplitude trough could dig into the west, and so or it could dig into the east, and there's not really a clear signal there based on the typhoon.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. For this particular case, over the past couple of years, we've noticed that those storms that turn northward in the West Pacific to the west of Japan typically get a warmer response to the pattern over the eastern half. But if it would turn northward in the northern Pacific to the east of Japan, you can get that colder response. This particular storm looks like it's going right at Japan.
Got it.
So that does make it a little bit trickier as far as is there a rule to this. But all in all, lots depends on what the base state of the atmosphere is. Is it something that's going to allow that jet stream to extend to the U.S. or not? And that's really the uncertainty associated with these storms. And models historically have not handled this very well for this lead time.
And I just have one more question on my end, and other folks can ask. But I'm thinking about Zach's research. I mentioned earlier that Zach's just starting to look at MJO relationships with the models. So to see kind of the ideas, do the models resolve well, different MJO configurations, whether it's initialized for forecasts and things like that. And I just want to go back to something you said. I just want to make sure I'm clear about it, and we are. So your forecast, right? You're certainly it shows a cooler pattern configuration in the eastern half of the country as compared to the ECMWF, right? And is that mostly due to the sort of information from the MJO and AAM leading you to a cooler solution? Is that the primary reason why you're kind of biasing a little bit cooler than the ECMWF, thinking that the ECMWF may not be fully resolving those signals, or is this something else?
No, that's exactly it. So just from the background, when we're looking at the MJO and we're looking at the AAM, I think the support is for things to move along more progressively than maybe where the ECMWF weeklies model has the pattern. And that, is despite the fact that we're actually using the ECMWF model when looking at the MJO and AAM. As far as how it's actually handling that, whether it's right or not, that's anyone's best guess at this stage. But but things that we do know is how these things have worked in the past. The question is the model know this, and is it figuring that out too? That I can't tell you. I mean, it certainly has that energy from the typhoon getting into the U.S., but stalling it out over the west would suggest that maybe you would have that colder outcome there. And even its weekly output's not really showing that. Now the model is 51 members. I mean, it's, a lot becomes spread because of that, and but to still have this warmer east signal is pretty significant, given that that signal is there among a large number of members from that model.
Got it. Thank you. We've got about 10 minutes, I think, here, or up to 10 minutes. Any other questions about the current forecast or any other issues, forecast issues of the day? Michael, is there anything on your end?
I'm just kind of wondering, you mentioned, we've been talking about the EC weeklies. Did the CFS weeklies have any kind of consistencies with them? So, is there a lot of its members that show cool in the East, since that seems to be, it seems awful cool, so I would imagine that's where it's going with it, but doesn't seem to be showing that much on on the map there.
Yeah, so the map that we have in the report is an average of the past 10 runs. So the reason we actually look at 10 runs is because the CFS model itself is only 4 members. So that's a very small sample relative to like ECNWF with its 51. So we do like to look at a larger set from the CFS to give us a larger ensemble. But yeah, there's certainly some runs that are showing the colder. You're seeing that in the national weighted HDD, the Boston Whisker plots within the report. I mean, generally when you do see those higher, especially this time of year, you can assume that it's showing that cold somewhere between the Midwest and the East, where those higher population centers are, where we do have a little bit more of that gas-weighted HDDs this time of year. But yeah, but one thing to take note too is that the lowest extreme, which is the warmest member, and then the highest extreme, which is the coldest member, actually a wider spread than the spread over the last 50 years. And so that's a good indication too that the model is not handling things well.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Yeah. Hey, Bradley, just maybe one other question on my end, and then we'll let you go. We talked to a couple different folks during the course of the summer, and some folks thought there were different views on this, but signals in the summer that could be relevant to the winter. One of the things that there were some different views on was like AO and NAO, and I think especially earlier in the summer we had negative AO and this and that. Is there anything in your experience as a forecaster? Are there anything, things that you see in the summer that you think do provide you with some information about, the following winter, or is it, in your view, just, noise at that point?
Yeah, it's really a mixed answer here. So as you mentioned with the NAO had a very long duration negative phase throughout the summer. So when we're looking at that, we're thinking, okay, what actually drove that? We have really 2 reasons that could have been a factor there that could be important for the winter forecast. The first is from the tropics. A warm pool around the international date line does give you a correlation to the negative NAO in summer. So we can look at that and say, how does that actually affect the pattern in winter? Actually does not give you the negative NAO response. Somewhat opposite of that, in that you do get more of a positive NAO Atlantic ridge that develops in the central latitudes. But the other factor is the solar cycle. So that's something that being in a solar minimum, that could have had a role in producing that negative NAO response in the summer. And if that's the case, it could continue to do that even through winter, just based on pattern correlations. Now, the solar cycle influence is more significant over the past 30 years as opposed to looking back to 1950 at a longer data set. But that significance is still there, especially over the past 30 years. So that's something that is worth keeping an eye on relative to that. From an oceanic perspective, you know, where the anomalies are, a lot of times they can last through winter. So if we have a warm tropics in particular, you can see that continue through winter. So you can look at those regions, be it like El Nino or another tropical Pacific region, and say, okay, that had a role in the summer. Maybe that has a role in the winter as well. Over the past couple of years, we've seen that with Western Pacific warm pools. Last couple of winters giving us that La Nina-like response. Even though last year we had an El Nino, you still had that southeast response that's typical of La Nina, and so that Western Pacific warm pool had a role in that. So we still have that that's out there, but you know, these things are out there in the summer, and we can do the correlation to see is there good significance for that to continue in the winter, and we can start to look at that as far as how we're going to draw up our winter forecast. If you look a little bit higher latitude, maybe at like a warm pool in the Gulf of Alaska, just as an example, that anomaly correlation from summer to winter is not as significant. So maybe that's something that when we see it in summer and we think, okay, does that actually have a role in winter? We can do the correlations and find out that not something we can be confident that will continue. So those are different things that we look at, especially, you know, in summer. We put out our initial winter forecast in the end of August. So we're basing that largely on what we know at the time, which is where things stood during the summer. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of a mixed answer, but not necessarily say this pattern was here in summer means this pattern will be there in winter, but some of the contributors to those patterns that evolved in summer, those contributors could be there in winter, and then we can see if that gives you the same kind of a response from an upper air perspective during the winter, or it's maybe something different.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Yep.
I just have one more question, Bradley. As David kind of mentioned before, I'm starting to work on a MGO research project relating model performance to initialize MGO phase. And a couple weeks ago, we had one of our other industry guests tell us, I don't remember if it was necessarily his opinion or opinion across the in industry in general, is that when the MJO is initialized in phases 4 and 5, the ECE struggles particularly to resolve those phases and, you know, get the pattern correct. Is that something that you've heard, agree with, anything like that?
Yeah, I would say so. Over the past couple of years, that's been the case. I don't know if that's something that's out there, you know, if we look back at a longer data set. But I know over the past couple of years, the ECMWF model tends to like to weaken the MJO too quickly when it is going through Indian Ocean towards Indonesia phases. So that's certainly something that's out there. You know, just a little bit more on the MJO front. You know, we typically, when we're using the MJO as far as a forecast influence, this is especially during the summer season and the winter season. It's a little bit trickier during the shoulder seasons, but we tend to do more of a filter on the MJO. So we're not necessarily looking at all possible dates of a certain amplitude, but we're actually narrowing down those dates that match maybe an oceanic pattern that we're seeing right now. So, you know, in the summertime, for example, this summer when we were looking at MJO plots, we would do a filter by the positive AMO to help capture that warm Atlantic influence as well. So that's something that we do in longer range. A lot of times the models can resolve those issues in the short term, but when we're looking at 11, 15-day period and beyond that, seeing, you know, some disagreement in the models, we can use those type of techniques to help narrow down maybe what makes sense for our forecast.
Cool, thank you.
All right, that's great. Well, thank you, Bradley. This has been very informative. Thanks for joining us. It's always great to have you guys, and you know, we look forward to having you back maybe here as we get a little bit more into the heating season.
Yep, sounds good.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. We'll see you again next week.
Yep,
Bye,
see
guys.
ya.